Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Thomas Mucha, geopolitical strategist for Wellington Management and a member of the firm's global macro team. I'm here today with two of my Wellington colleagues to discuss our key views on the year ahead, one that's already off to a challenging start on multiple fronts. We have three perspectives for you on that today: domestic, geopolitical, and of course, the market implications. So first, Mike Meideros, global macro strategist and the firm's top U.S. domestic political analyst, and also Nanette Abuhoff Jacobson, investment management strategist, and the firm's authority on our multi-asset allocation strategies. So thank you both for being here today. And I want to start with Mike. And Mike, how are you thinking about, the ongoing and extraordinary events that are happening right now in Washington, D.C., from insurrection to impeachment proceedings to talk about the 25th Amendment, threats of further violence? How's that going to impact President-elect Biden's policy plans out of the gate?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, and thank you for everyone for joining today. So I think it's a really important question, and structurally, it's a really concerning example of the growing fault lines in the U.S. around polarization. I think this is really a function of the significant inequality in our system, not just of income, but of opportunity, race, access to healthcare, and education. To give an example, one measure of polarization that we track, which looks at how often members of the opposing party vote together, would suggest Congress is actually the most polarized since the Civil War. So if you, like me, think Congress is a function of the electorate, then it reflects broader society. Now, there's been significant academic literature written on this topic as well. And as Thomas, as you're well aware, was a notable root cause of the Arab Spring about a decade ago. So to your question, what does this mean in practice? I think there are a few short-term and medium-term implications. As we'll get to in more detail in a second, a main focus for the Democrats this year and structurally will be around reducing inequality, in particular, raising the labor share of income. This has been proposed significantly with probably the most progressive agenda since FDR, through domestic spending and infrastructure, education, and healthcare, offset with higher taxes for corporations and upper income individuals. There will be more programs and incentives as well that will be focused on domestic production. So will the events of the last 2 weeks be a catalyst for the Democrats to be more aggressive with their policy proposals? I think at the margin, yes. The bar to remove the filibuster outright remains very high, given the narrow majority in the Senate. But could they modify it for emergency supplemental legislation? Absolutely. Could they more aggressively pursue legislation through a reconciliation bill? Absolutely. While it's still unclear how aggressive the Democrats will be in the coming months, I think the events of last week probably increased the probability of a more significant policy response. If successful over the medium term, raising the labor share of income should lead to higher nominal wage growth and should be, all else equal, more inflationary. This would be a structural headwind for treasuries with higher inflation expectations as well. Now, institutional trust, Thomas, something you and I have talked about many times, has been under pressure for some time. An average of trust in institutions has trended lower on a structural basis over the last 50 years in the U.S. The recent seizure of the Capitol is another critical test of the faith in institutions domestically, a test we're going through literally as we speak. So while there are multiple other factors that influence the dollar on a medium-term basis, I think erosion of institutional trust is a significant and growing headwind in the context of a large current account deficit. Now, specific policy implications, I think you take a step back, and the implications of the Democrats winning the Senate cannot be understated. Even though the majority is razor thin, it's really critical for spending, taxation, and regulatory decisions, as well as cabinet appointments. So from a high level, I mentioned inequality, but the Biden agenda really tries to tackle three significant and structural issues. Inequality, number one, the ongoing effects of the pandemic, number two, and climate change, number three. There's going to be a large focus in the coming weeks and months on setting in place policies to again increase the labor share and reverse inequality through spending and taxation. If you look at Biden's plans holistically, $7 trillion in increase in spending and $4 trillion over 10 years with a tax increase. Now, without removal of the filibuster, I think accomplishing all of these goals is unlikely. Major legislation will have to be passed through the reconciliation process. It's worth noting that other significant policy changes over time, notably the Affordable Care Act and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that have any spending or revenue provision, have been passed through reconciliation. Now, there's one interesting aspect of reconciliation called the Byrd Rule, which requires any legislation has to have a net zero effect on the budget over 10 years. I'll be paying very close attention to any modifications in the Byrd Rule over the coming weeks and months, because it would have significant implications for the capacity and scope of the reconciliation bill itself. And so right now, my sense is we see another COVID relief package similar to the amount that was passed in December, about 3 to 4% of GDP, to be passed later this quarter, contain an expansion of unemployment benefits, additional state and local aid, additional individual checks, top it up to $2,000 from the current $600 rate, and potentially infrastructure. If infrastructure is not included in the COVID relief bill, then I think it's likely to be pushed to Q3 as a standalone bill and include tax changes as well in the context of reconciliation. Now, the sequencing and direct effect from an economic perspective of those policy changes is fluid and subject to change. Biden will be releasing a starting point for the negotiations, and we should expect false starts on passing legislation. It's highly likely, given the narrow balance in the Senate, particularly given the enormous power that centrist Democrats now hold. It's worth remembering, too, that it took Republicans about a year to pass tax cuts in 2017 with a Senate and House majority, and Democrats over a year to pass healthcare reform in 2009 with close to 60 votes in the Senate in addition to a House majority. And so things will take time, but as the markets responded over the last week and a half to the Senate races in Georgia, we do think that the probability of additional easing has gone up. Now, Thomas, let me kick it over to you. What do you think the geopolitical and foreign policy implications of recent events is?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks for that overview of the domestic side. Very helpful. On the foreign policy side, these events are extraordinary, and I think it's going to take a lot of time to fully understand the root causes and the implications. I agree that this is first, by and large, a domestic political event in the United States. And therefore, the response to this will be largely domestic. I do agree that U.S. institutions, broadly speaking, are meeting this test. And I do think we're going to get to the other side of this crisis eventually. And that includes the steadiness that we're seeing at the Defense Department and maybe the stabilizing role that the National Guard is now playing ahead of the inauguration. That said, the foreign policy and the geopolitical implications, they're significant and they're multidimensional. I'll point to just two factors that I think are most important here. First, from a geopolitical perspective, what happened at the Capitol? It's a huge gift to U.S. adversaries who seek to undermine U.S. global influence in particular, but also who seek to undermine democracy and democratic systems more broadly. So Russia, Iran, North Korea, pretty much every other authoritarian government around the world is already attempting to exploit the events of last week, first to gain geostrategic advantage in a world of great power competition, but also to bolster their own domestic political support. So I think that's the first thing. And so it's a huge hit to U.S. global leadership credibility. And second, and probably more importantly, from a practical foreign policy perspective in the Biden administration, I do think this setback to U.S. leadership prestige, it was already suffering under the Trump administration, and it's likely to limit the Biden administration's hope of forming a coalition of democracies as a way to push back against global extremism and the global authoritarian challenge. I think they'll still attempt to be more multilateral, to move closer to U.S. allies, to use global institutions in a more coordinated fashion on trade and foreign policy and other issues. But I do think U.S. foreign policy just got a lot more challenging. And again, none of this is helpful as the U.S. attempts to manage through what really is the most complex geopolitical backdrop in decades. starting with the most important U.S. foreign policy issue of great power trade and supply chain issues involving China. So, it does put the Biden administration's foreign policy plans a bit in a box, and so we'll have to see how that plays out. So that's my quick view on the geopolitics, and we can talk more specifics later. But I'd like to bring Nanette into the conversation now and ask her about, Nanette, what are your initial market views considering what's happening in Washington these days?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas, and thanks everybody for joining. It was interesting. I happened to be recording a markets view on Wednesday afternoon when the insurrection was occurring. So it was quite unsettling for everyone, for listeners, and for me personally. But what we saw was that in those hours, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, the markets had been up 1.8%, and they were down. They had halved the gain, but they were still up, equity markets. And I do think that's an indication of what markets are thinking, that while we have all this tumult on the political side, that, as you said, Thomas, institutional strength in the United States goes back not just the past few years, but many, many decades and generations. And I think the market is counting that we will at least get through this period of volatility and uncertainty, and that institutional strength is stable enough that it can carry us through this, unprecedented period. So it has not really changed my views that the most important things for markets are, A, the course of the virus against the vaccine, which, as I've said several times, we have safe, effective vaccines. The rollout has been certainly full of potholes and has had snafus, but our healthcare team and I think that the vaccines will be distributed this year, and we will be on the road to recovery. Add to that the fact that we've got tremendous fiscal stimulus in the system, both from on the fiscal side as well as the monetary side. And as Mike alluded to already, we should expect another fiscal package in the first quarter for COVID relief and possibly more for infrastructure. We are looking at a very strong period for the economy and globally and for markets. And so from that perspective, laying that out as a backdrop, I certainly think that equities will outperform bonds this year. But the big call is that within equities, I think that value and value-oriented strategies are going to outperform growth. I am not just referring to a single factor, value versus growth. I'm really talking about the whole spectrum of value type trades. So that means that I think for the first time in 15 years, U.S. equities will actually underperform non-U.S. equities. So I think Europe, Japan, emerging markets equities will outperform the U.S. I think also that within sectors, cyclical sectors, value-oriented sectors, particularly financials, will be outperformers this year relative to tech and other growth areas. And then in terms of market cap, I see smaller cap in the mid cap and small cap space outperforming large cap. So these are very different moves than what we're accustomed to over the past decade. But the reason that I expect this mean reversion to occur is because all these assets have very cheap valuations relative to large cap growth in the US. The reason that I think mean reversion will take hold is because we have a catalyst, and the catalyst is something the market feels more confident in, which is a safe, effective vaccine. And that changes the entire market's narrative for this year.
Nanette, what about the sectoral implications of the economic policy that Mike laid out coming from the Biden administration? Who do you think, or what do you see as being the winners and losers from a sector basis?
Right. So, we had a year in 2020 of COVID winners and losers, and the winners tended to be e-commerce, home builders, sectors of the market that were really resilient and benefited actually from working from home, from road trips and car travel. And so, we have to think now about the sectors that could now come into play, which were COVID losers last year. So in that sense, I'm thinking about travel, recreation, casinos, things that are much more cyclically geared to a recovery in the economy. Apart from that, again, going back to Mike's comments about infrastructure being one of the Biden's goals, that certainly sets up a scenario where materials, transport, trucking, construction also does quite well. Now, I do think you need to be sensitive about pricing, and infrastructure is something that's been out there as a plan. So you do want to consider valuations. But broadly speaking, I think those are the sectors, more cyclical sectors, more tied to infrastructure, that are bound to have a strong rebound this year.
Great. And Mike, I'd like to go back for a minute on the politics for a second here. Two-part question for you. And the first is, how are you thinking about the impact of the 22 midterms on the policy agenda? I know I've been getting a lot of indications from Biden transition members that they're really thinking about the domestic political implications in that context. And the second part of this is, how do you see the Republican Party coming out of this? What's the Republican Party likely to look like in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think the Biden campaign and soon-to-be administration is well aware of congressional history, where when you have all three, House, Senate, and White House, it's very rare to maintain those majorities for a long period of time. And so I think the Biden campaign and administration will be under the impression that their narrow majorities in the House and Senate are temporary, and therefore to use everything they can to pass as much of their agenda as possible over the next 18 months. Now, what it means for the Republican Party is, it's interesting. In the Democratic primary, we saw kind of a split in the candidates, right? And the candidates, reflect the broader electorate, where there were center-left candidates, and then there were more progressive candidates as well. I think a similar dynamic is going on in the Republican Party, where there's the more populist wing of the party, which is the dominant aspect led by Trump. And then there's a growing number of center-right House and in particular Senate members that are more traditional Republicans. And so that split within the party is ongoing. I think what it could mean in practice is it's possible over the next 6 to 12 months, we see more senators and maybe House members from the center-right coalition that do try to be a little bit more cooperative in passing some aspects of the Democrats' agenda. As we talked about earlier, I think the polarization is structural, it's growing, and it's in place for really important reasons. And so if we were to see some bipartisanship over the next 6 to 12 months, my bias would be it wouldn't last. But that's something I'll be watching pretty closely in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have to be a little more attuned to the domestic political situation in the U.S. in the months and years ahead. Nanette, a question for you about the risks to your view here. I mean, what could derail your views on equities doing well here?
Well, there are a couple of scenarios that I'm thinking about. The first is, again, related, my view is really centered around the successful rollout of the vaccine and a continuation of reopening of economies. So we are obviously in the midst of another tragic chapter in the coronavirus and with a new mutation and cases and deaths soaring. So if we, have a situation where whole broad economies have to be shut down again, that would obviously derail the recovery story. And so that is, I think, the biggest risk right now. The second risk is one that we've been talking about at the firm, which is a rise in interest rates at the long end of the yield curve. We've already seen 10-year treasuries rise above 1%, and the yield curve steepen. And that dynamic, behind that dynamic is the fact that the Fed has committed to keeping rates at zero and also committed to looking through inflation, even if it rises above 2%. So a big steepening of the yield curve and higher 10-year rates could be trouble for, again, some of those growth sectors that I spoke about, because those valuations have certainly been influenced by very, very low interest rates, counting on the fact that those future earnings are going to be coming in consistently year after year after year. A higher discount rate just by the math means that those earnings are worth less. So I think that's a threat. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity because financials would be directly benefited from that kind of yield curve dynamic.
And just to go over, some of those from a economic perspective as well. Taking a step back, our bias has been for a further cyclical deceleration in Q4 into Q1, and it's largely due to the lagged impact of fiscal drag and the public health deterioration. As Nanette said, more state and local governments are reversing their reopening plans. And so I think at the margin, a Democratic sweep probably increases our confidence in that short-term trajectory, largely due to the lower bar to implement a more restrictive national public health policy. Now, the downside of this would be a more severe slowdown in Q1, but the upside, obviously, the goal would be to eradicate the virus more successfully. As Nanette said, the Fed remains a really important support for the markets and the economy more broadly with respect to financial conditions, and they should remain supportive in the short term. Now, in the medium term, our bias for Q2 and beyond is probably a bit above consensus expectations and for a lower unemployment rate than the Fed expects. And importantly, as Nanette mentioned, this is really dependent on a positive vaccine outcome that reduces uncertainty and unleashes pent-up demand. So, of course, any delays in the distribution process, adverse effects from the vaccine, or mutations not covered by the vaccine would represent an important downside risk. And it's worth noting, too, that the vaccination process really does need to pick up. Right now, the U.S. is well behind their own self-imposed goals. Only 2.8% of the population has received a first dose. At the current rate, which is about 540,000 dosages a day, the U.S. wouldn't reach 75% vaccination until early 2022. And so our bias is that vaccination rate does pick up, but of course remains to be seen. Now, importantly, too, with respect to the economic outlook, as we mentioned before, the probability of more fiscal easing has certainly increased. And so that definitely increases our confidence, assuming a smooth vaccination process for the second half of the year.
Great, and I think I'll end on a point which you usually don't hear from me, which is a little bit of optimism from the geopolitical perspective, and that's really about the U.S.-China relationship, and I am feeling somewhat better about the trajectory of that, at least over the next 12 months or so. I think you're likely to see more coordination in the U.S. across agencies. There's more consultation with U.S. allies, more input from business interests. All of that, I think, is going to lead to more predictability in the U.S.-China relationship. I'm not expecting midnight tweets from the Biden administration to surprise the market. All of that should be a market positive. I also think defense spending is likely to be supported for years to come by this great power competition that we're seeing and this challenging global geopolitical backdrop. I think the focus there and the real policy and market focus will be on advanced technologies, missile defense, anything having to do with space, next generation communications, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all of the aspects that are driving this doctrinal shift towards more advanced technologies as the US, China, Russia, and other great powers confront each other. The last thing I would say, and I would urge our audience to really think about an increase in what are known as shadow wars. And these are basically great power conflicts that fall just short of military activity. And the key friction points here are on the cyber side, including rising corporate risks as the battlefield expands to include corporations, but also better intelligence coordination with key U.S. allies, including the Five Eyes Alliance, the emerging Quad military alliance, NATO, and others. And I think all of this puts a premium on better diplomacy and the military and technical equipment to carry out these evolving military doctrines. So there's a lot to sort through from a geopolitical and investment perspective. But I do think the next 12 months, at least in the US-China area, are likely to be more predictable and therefore more positive. So why don't we end on that? Once again, I'll thank the both of you, Mike Meideros and Nanette Abuhoff Jacobson, for your insights today. And I thank all of you for joining us here for this discussion about where we see a challenging 2021 going from here. Thanks again. I'm Thomas Mucha, and take care.